The morning mist clung to Mount Rainier's lower slopes like a shroud as Detective Sarah Mitchell parked her patrol car at the Paradise Visitor Center. It was September 15th, 2000, and what should have been a routine follow-up on a hiking permit violation had turned into something far more disturbing. 3 days earlier, a park maintenance crew had discovered a weathered backpack protruding from the melting ice near the Nisqually Glacier, and the contents had sent shockwaves through both the local climbing community and law enforcement. Sarah stepped out of her vehicle, breathing in the crisp mountain air that carried the scent of pine and something else, the indefinable smell of secrets about to be revealed. At 34, she had been with the Pierce County Sheriff's Department for 12 years, but this was her first case involving Mount Rainier's notorious history of swallowing climbers whole. The mountain loomed above her, its glaciated peak shrouded in clouds, indifferent to the human drama unfolding at its base. Chief Ranger Tom Bradley met her at the visitor center, his weathered face etched with concern. At 58, Bradley had seen everything the mountain could throw at rescue teams: avalanches, crevasse falls, hypothermia cases, and bodies that emerged from glaciers decades after disappearing. But something about this discovery troubled him more than usual. The backpack belonged to Jake Morrison, Bradley explained as they walked toward his office. 26 years old, from Tacoma. He and his climbing partner Chen were reported missing in January 1984. "We searched for 2 weeks before weather forced us to call it off," Sarah nodded, pulling out her notebook. The Pierce County Sheriff's Department had inherited jurisdiction over the case because both missing climbers were county residents, and their families had never stopped pressing for answers. What made this disappearance different from the others? Bradley paused at his office door, choosing his words carefully. Jake Morrison wasn't just any climber. He worked for Boeing as an aerospace engineer, had high-level security clearance for military contracts. Chen was a University of Washington graduate student in geology, specializing in volcanic activity. Smart guys, experienced mountaineers, not the type to make rookie mistakes. Inside Bradley's office, evidence bags containing the backpack's contents were spread across a conference table. Sarah examined each item methodically: a water bottle with a 1983 manufacturing date, energy bars that had somehow survived 16 years of glacial preservation, and most intriguingly, a sealed plastic bag containing what appeared to be geological samples and a detailed notebook. "Have you read through the notebook?" Sarah asked. "That's why I called you," Bradley replied grimly. "Take a look at the final entries." Sarah opened the preserved notebook, its pages still legible despite their long entombment in ice. Jake Morrison's engineering training showed in his precise handwriting and systematic documentation of their climb. The early entries were routine: weather observations, route descriptions, equipment checks, but the final pages told a different story entirely. January 18th, 1984. Alex discovered something unusual in the rock formations near 11,000 feet. Volcanic glass formations that don't match known eruption patterns, taking samples for analysis. Weather deteriorating, but Alex insists we need more specimens. January 19th, 1984. Storm worse than predicted. Alex, acting strangely, says the samples are more important than we realized. Won't explain what he means. We should descend, but he refuses to leave without additional specimens from higher elevations. January 20th, 1984. Alex revealed he's been in contact with someone from the U.S. Geological Survey about his research. Claims Mount Rainier might be showing signs of increased volcanic activity that officials are hiding from the public. Says his samples could prove it. Now, I understand why he's been so secretive. Sarah looked up at Bradley. Did the families know about this geological research? Chen's advisor at the university claimed Alex was working on a standard thesis about Cascade volcanism, nothing about secret government cover-ups or dangerous volcanic activity. The families were told both men died in a climbing accident, which seemed obvious given the conditions they faced. Sarah continued reading Jake's increasingly frantic final entries. January 21st, 1984. Alex fell into crevasse while collecting samples at 12,200 feet. I managed to get him out, but he's injured. Possible concussion, definitely hypothermic. He keeps talking about seismic readings that don't add up, and pressure changes that indicate imminent activity. I can't tell if it's the head injury or if he knows something real. January 22nd, 1984. Alex died during the night. Before he lost consciousness, he made me promise to get his samples to Dr. Margaret Foster at the USGS office in Seattle. Said she would understand their significance, storm too severe to attempt descent, using his geological equipment to attempt emergency signals. The final entry was written in shaking handwriting. If someone finds this, the samples are in my pack. Alex believed Mount Rainier is more active than officially reported. Don't know if he was right, but he died believing it mattered. Tell his family he was trying to protect people. Bradley leaned back in his chair. The geological samples are still viable after all these years in the ice. I've contacted Dr. Foster at USGS. She's retired now but remembers Alex Chen. She's agreed to examine the specimens, though she seemed nervous when I explained the circumstances. Sarah felt the familiar tingle of a case that was more complex than it first appeared. What about the families? Are they still in the area? Alex's parents moved back to California years ago, but Jake's sister Linda Morrison Webb still lives in Tacoma. She never accepted that her brother's death was a simple climbing accident. She's been requesting case files for 16 years. Before Sarah could respond, Bradley's phone rang. He answered, listened for several minutes, then hung up with a troubled expression. That was the National Weather Service. They've been reviewing historical seismic data from January 1984, and they found something interesting. There was unusual earthquake activity around Mount Rainier during the exact period when Jake and Alex disappeared. Minor tremors that were classified as normal geological adjustment at the time. Sarah closed the notebook, her mind racing. I need to interview Dr. Foster and Linda Morrison Webb immediately, and I want to see all the original search and rescue reports from 1984. There's something else, Bradley added reluctantly. When the maintenance crew found Jake's backpack, they also discovered Alex Chen's climbing gear about 50 yards away. His pack was damaged, but inside we found additional geological samples and what appears to be correspondence with someone at the USGS that predates their climb by several months. Sarah examined the letters, which were remarkably preserved in waterproof pouches. The correspondence revealed that Alex had been in secret communication with Dr. Margaret Foster throughout 1983, sharing preliminary findings about unusual seismic activity around Mount Rainier. Foster's responses were cautious but encouraging, suggesting that Alex might be onto something significant. One letter from Foster, dated December 15, 1983, contained an ominous warning. Your observations about increased fumarole activity and micro-earthquake patterns are consistent with data we've been collecting internally. However, I must caution you against pursuing this research independently. There are political and economic considerations that complicate how such information is handled publicly. Alex's response, dated December 28, 1983, showed his determination. Dr. Foster, I understand your concerns, but if Mount Rainier is becoming more active, people living in the surrounding areas have a right to know. My winter climb will allow me to collect samples from elevations that are typically inaccessible. If my analysis confirms increased volcanic activity, I intend to make the findings public, regardless of political considerations. Sarah realized she was looking at evidence of a potential government cover-up of volcanic hazards, assuming Chen's amateur research had any validity. Bradley, I need you to contact the current USGS team and see if they have any records of Chen or his research. And I want to know if there have been other climbers who've made similar claims about Mount Rainier's volcanic activity. Already ahead of you, Bradley replied, pulling out another file. I found 3 other disappearances between 1978 and 1995 involving climbers who had geology or seismology backgrounds. Robert Vance in 1978, graduate student in earth sciences from Washington State University. Maria Santos in 1987, seismologist working for a private consulting firm. David Park in 1995, retired USGS employee who had expressed concerns about Cascade volcanic monitoring. Sarah stared at the files. That's 4 geologically trained climbers who disappeared on Mount Rainier over 17 years. What are the odds of that being coincidental? Gets stranger, Bradley continued. I contacted the families of the other missing climbers. Robert Vance's advisor said he had been working on a project about anomalous seismic signatures in the Cascade Range. Maria Santos had recently quit her job, telling colleagues she had discovered irregularities in official volcanic hazard assessments that were being suppressed. David Park's family said he had been trying to reach journalists about compromised scientific integrity at the USGS before he disappeared. The implications were staggering. Either Mount Rainier had an unusual attraction for conspiracy-minded geologists, or there was a pattern of researchers stumbling onto sensitive information about volcanic risks that weren't being shared with the public. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her sergeant. Mitchell, need you back at station ASAP. Woman claiming connection to Mount Rainier missing climbers case wants to talk. Says she has information about government cover-up. She showed the message to Bradley, who whistled softly. 16 years this case has been cold, and now everything breaks loose in 1 week. As Sarah prepared to leave, she turned back to Bradley. I want those geological samples tested by an independent laboratory, not USGS, and I want to know everything about Dr. Margaret Foster's career. When she started at USGS, what projects she worked on, why she retired, and whether she's had contact with any other missing climbers. Bradley nodded grimly. Sarah, if there's even a chance that these climbers discovered evidence of volcanic hazards being covered up, we're dealing with something much bigger than missing persons cases. We could be looking at criminal negligence that's put thousands of lives at risk. Sarah drove back toward Tacoma through the afternoon shadows, Mount Rainier looming in her rearview mirror like a silent witness to secrets that had been frozen in ice for 16 years. She had started the day expecting to close a routine cold case, but instead found herself at the beginning of an investigation that could shake public confidence in government safety agencies. The woman waiting at the police station might have answers, or she might be another conspiracy theorist drawn to the mystery of Mount Rainier's missing climbers. But Sarah's instincts told her that Jake Morrison and Chen had died for more than their love of mountaineering. They had died because they had discovered something that someone didn't want revealed. As the mountain disappeared behind the trees, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Mount Rainier itself was trying to tell her something, that the glacier had released Jake's backpack now, after 16 years, because it was time for the truth to emerge. The frozen trail was finally beginning to thaw, and Sarah Mitchell was about to discover just how deep the secrets of America's most dangerous peak really went. The drive back to Tacoma gave her time to process what she had learned and prepare for whatever revelation awaited her at the station. 4 geologists had vanished on Mount Rainier over 17 years, all apparently investigating unusual volcanic activity. Their families deserved answers, And if there was a cover-up, the public deserved to know the truth about the risks they faced living in the shadow of an active volcano. But first, she had to determine whether Alex Chen had been a dedicated scientist uncovering genuine safety concerns, or a paranoid graduate student whose imagination had gotten him and his friend killed. The evidence in Jake Morrison's notebook suggested the former, but Sarah knew that confirmation bias could make anyone see patterns where none existed. She needed hard proof, independent verification, and testimony from witnesses who could separate fact from speculation. The geological samples would be crucial. If Alex's specimens truly showed signs of increased volcanic activity that differed from official USGS assessments, it would support his claims of a cover-up. If the samples were unremarkable, it would suggest that Alex had been pursuing a dangerous delusion that cost 2 lives. Either way, Sarah was determined to find the truth. Jake Morrison and Alex Chen deserved justice, their families deserved closure, and the public deserved to know whether the government agencies tasked with protecting them from natural disasters were being honest about the risks they faced. Mount Rainier had kept its secrets for 16 years, but Detective Sarah Mitchell intended to make sure it kept them no longer. Linda Morrison Webb sat in the Pierce County Sheriff's Department interview room, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. At 41, she bore a strong resemblance to her missing brother Jake. The same determined jawline, the same intelligent eyes that seemed to analyze everything around them. For 16 years, she had refused to accept the official explanation that Jake and Alex had simply made a fatal error in judgment during their January 1984 climb. Detective Sarah Mitchell entered the room, carrying a thick case file and the evidence recovered from Mount Rainier. She had spent the drive from Paradise thinking about how to approach this interview. Linda Morrison Webb had been persistent in her pursuit of answers about her brother's death, submitting Freedom of Information Act requests, hiring private investigators, and generally making herself a thorn in the side of every agency that had touched the case. Ms. Morrison Webb, thank you for coming in. I'm Detective Mitchell, and I'm reopening the investigation into your brother's disappearance. Linda's eyes lit up with a mixture of hope and wariness. After 16 years, what changed? Sarah opened the evidence bag containing Jake's notebook. We found this 3 days ago, preserved in glacial ice. Your brother's final entries suggest that his disappearance might not have been a simple climbing accident. Linda read through the notebook with growing excitement and vindication. I knew it, she whispered. I always knew Jake didn't die because of some rookie mistake. He was too careful, too experienced. She looked up at Sarah. Alex Chen was investigating Mount Rainier's volcanic activity, wasn't he? According to your brother's notes, yes, but I need to understand why you've been so certain there was more to this story. What did you know that the original investigators didn't? Linda pulled out a worn folder from her purse, filled with documents she had collected over 16 years of private investigation. Jake called me 2 days before he left for the climb. He was excited about something Alex had discovered, said they were going to collect evidence that would change how people think about living near Mount Rainier. He wouldn't give me details, but he said Alex had been in contact with government scientists who were concerned about official safety assessments. Sarah leaned forward. Did Jake mention any names, specific agencies? He mentioned the U.S. Geological Survey, and he said Alex had been corresponding with someone named Dr. Margaret Foster. Jake seemed nervous about the whole thing, which wasn't like him. He loved dangerous climbs, but this felt different to him, like they were doing something that could get them in trouble. Linda pulled out another document from her folder. After Jake disappeared, I tried to contact Dr. Foster at USGS. I was told she was unavailable for comment and that the agency had no record of correspondence with Alex Chen. But I kept digging. She handed Sarah a copy of a 1983 personnel directory from the University of Washington Department of Earth and Space Sciences. Alex Chen was listed as a graduate research assistant working on a project called Seismic Anomaly Assessment in Cascade Volcanic Systems. His faculty advisor was Dr. Richard Steinberg, who retired abruptly in June 1984, just 5 months after Alex disappeared. Sarah studied the document. "Did you ever speak with Dr. Steinberg?" "I tried for years. He moved to Colorado after retiring, changed his phone number, refused all contact. But in 1995, I finally tracked him down. He was dying of cancer and agreed to see me." Linda's voice dropped to a whisper. "Dr. Steinberg told me that Alex had been working on classified research for the government, analyzing seismic data from monitoring stations around Mount Rainier and other Cascade volcanoes." "Classified research? For which agency?" He wouldn't say specifically, but he implied it was connected to national security concerns about volcanic hazards near major population centers. According to Steinberg, Alex had identified patterns in the seismic data that suggested Mount Rainier was more active than publicly reported, and that official hazard assessments were being deliberately downplayed to avoid economic disruption. Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to align. What happened when Alex tried to go public with his findings? Linda opened another folder, revealing copies of correspondence between Dr. Steinberg and various government agencies. Steinberg received visits from federal agents in December 1983, warning him that Alex's research involved sensitive national security information that couldn't be disclosed publicly. They offered Alex a position with USGS if he would keep his findings confidential, but Alex refused. So Alex decided to collect additional evidence during the January climb to support his claims. Exactly. Jake told me that Alex believed independent geological samples from high elevations would provide irrefutable proof of increased volcanic activity. He planned to publish his findings regardless of government pressure. Linda's eyes filled with tears. "I think they were killed because of what they knew." Sarah chose her words carefully. "Linda, that's a serious accusation. Are you suggesting that government agents somehow caused your brother's death?" "Not directly," Linda replied, "but I think Jake and Alex were allowed to climb into dangerous conditions because certain people hoped they wouldn't come back. The weather forecast for that weekend was much worse than what climbers were told. I've seen the internal National Weather Service reports. They predicted severe storm conditions starting January 19th, but climbers weren't warned until January 20th. Linda pulled out meteorological reports she had obtained through FOIA requests. "Look at this. The official weather briefing given to climbers on January 18th called for possible light snow with moderate winds. The internal NWS forecast for the same period predicted severe winter storm, with high avalanche danger and zero visibility above 10,000 feet. Sarah examined the documents, noting the significant discrepancy between public and internal weather assessments. "How did you obtain these internal reports?" "It took me 8 years of legal battles and FOIA appeals, but I finally got them in 1992. By then, most people had forgotten about Jake and Alex. But I never forgot, and I never stopped looking for evidence that their deaths weren't accidental." Linda opened her final folder, revealing what appeared to be surveillance photographs. "In 1989, I hired a private investigator to look into Dr. Margaret Foster's background. We discovered that she had worked on classified volcanic monitoring projects for the Department of Defense from 1978 to 1985. Focusing on strategic volcanic hazard assessment for critical infrastructure protection. The photographs showed Dr. Foster meeting with men in suits at various locations around Seattle. My investigator identified two of the men as CIA officers working out of the Seattle field office. The meetings took place throughout 1983 and early 1984, exactly when Alex Chen was conducting his research. Sarah studied the surveillance photos, her mind racing with implications. Linda, if what you're suggesting is true, we're talking about a conspiracy involving multiple federal agencies to suppress information about volcanic hazards that could affect millions of people. I know how it sounds, Linda replied. But consider this. How many other graduate students have disappeared while researching Cascade volcanism? How many other scientists have been pressured to keep quiet about hazard assessments? I found at least 6 similar cases between 1978 and 1995. Linda handed Sarah a list of names and dates. All of these researchers were investigating volcanic activity in the Cascade Range, and all of them either disappeared, died in suspicious accidents, or abandoned their research after being contacted by government agencies. Sarah reviewed the list, recognizing some of the names from the files Chief Ranger Bradley had mentioned. Have you shared this information with other law enforcement agencies? I've tried. The FBI told me it was outside their jurisdiction. The Washington State Patrol said it was a federal matter. The Pierce County Sheriff's Department, until today, treated me like a conspiracy theorist who couldn't accept her brother's accidental death. Linda leaned forward intently. Detective Mitchell, you're the first law enforcement officer who's taken this seriously. What changed? Sarah decided to share some of what she had learned. We found correspondence between Alex Chen and Dr. Margaret Foster that supports your claims about their secret research relationship. And we discovered geological samples that Alex collected before he disappeared. Samples that might prove whether his theories about Mount Rainier were correct. Linda's face lit up with vindication and grief. After 16 years, someone finally believes me. Jake died trying to help Alex expose the truth about volcanic hazards. They weren't just mountain climbers, they were whistleblowers who died because they cared more about public safety than their own lives. Sarah closed her notebook, overwhelmed by the scope of what Linda had uncovered through years of determined investigation. I need to ask you something important. Do you believe your brother and Alex Chen are still alive? Linda shook her head sadly. No, I accepted long ago that they died on that mountain. But I've never accepted that their deaths were meaningless accidents. If their research was valid, then people living near Mount Rainier deserve to know the truth about the risks they face. What do you want to see happen with this investigation? I want the geological samples Alex collected to be analyzed by independent scientists. I want Dr. Margaret Foster to explain her correspondence with Alex and her meetings with CIA officers. I want the meteorological cover-up exposed so that future climbers get accurate weather information. And I want my brother's reputation cleared. Jake Morrison wasn't a reckless climber who made fatal mistakes. He was a patriotic American who died trying to protect his fellow citizens. Sarah gathered the evidence files, knowing that Linda Morrison Webb had just provided her with the roadmap for an investigation that could expose one of the most significant government cover-ups in Pacific Northwest history. Linda, I'm going to need you to testify before a grand jury if this investigation proceeds. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Detective Mitchell, I've been preparing for this moment for 16 years. I have copies of every document, recordings of every phone call, and photographs of every meeting. If there's finally a chance to get justice for Jake and Alex, I'm ready to do whatever it takes. As Linda left the interview room, Sarah reflected on the transformation of what had seemed like a routine cold case review. She now had evidence of government surveillance of civilian researchers, suppression of volcanic hazard information, manipulation of weather forecasts, and possibly the deliberate endangerment of climbers who threatened to expose classified information. But she also knew that accusations against federal agencies required extraordinary evidence. Linda Morrison Webb's 16 years of investigation had provided a foundation, but Sarah needed corroboration from other sources, scientific analysis of the geological samples, and testimony from government officials who had been involved in the original cover-up. The next phase of her investigation would require delicate handling of political sensitivities while pursuing the truth about what Jake Morrison and Alex Chen had discovered on Mount Rainier. Their frozen gear had emerged from the glacier at exactly the right moment, when public awareness of government accountability was high, and when scientific techniques could finally analyze evidence that had been preserved in ice for 16 years. Sarah knew that powerful people would not want this investigation to proceed, but Linda Morrison Webb's dedication had convinced her that Jake and Alex deserved justice, regardless of the political consequences. The frozen trail was leading toward a confrontation with forces that had successfully buried the truth for over a decade. But Detective Sarah Mitchell was determined to follow it wherever it led. The mountain had kept its secrets long enough. It was time for Mount Rainier to reveal what had really happened during that deadly January storm in 1984, and why two young men had died trying to warn their fellow Americans about dangers that government officials had decided to keep hidden. Dr. Margaret Foster lived in a modest craftsman-style house in Seattle's Ballard neighborhood, surrounded by the kind of carefully maintained garden that suggested someone who had spent decades studying the natural world. At 73, she moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had been betrayed by age, but whose mind remained sharp. When Detective Sarah Mitchell knocked on her door that crisp October morning, Dr. Foster seemed to be expecting her. "You're here about Alex Chen," she said without preamble, stepping aside to let Sarah enter. "I wondered when someone would finally come asking the right questions." Sarah followed her into a living room lined with geological specimens, scientific journals, and what appeared to be decades of research files. Framed photographs showed a younger Dr. Foster at various volcanic sites around the world, often accompanied by teams of serious-looking scientists carrying monitoring equipment. "Dr. Foster, I'm investigating the disappearance of Alex Chen and Jake Morrison in January 1984. We found correspondence between you and Mr. Chen that suggests you were collaborating on research about Mount Rainier's volcanic activity." Dr. Foster poured tea with hands that shook slightly, but her voice was steady and clear. "Alex Chen was one of the most brilliant young geologists I ever encountered. He had an intuitive understanding of volcanic systems that typically takes decades to develop. Unfortunately, his brilliance made him dangerous to people who preferred that certain information remain classified." Sarah opened her notebook. "What kind of information?" "Alex discovered that Mount Rainier was showing signs of increased volcanic activity that weren't being reported to the public. Micro-earthquake patterns, changes in gas emissions, subtle ground deformation. Indicators that suggested the volcano was entering a more active phase." Dr. Foster sat down heavily in her chair. "The problem wasn't that Alex was wrong. The problem was that he was absolutely right. If Alex's research was accurate, why wasn't it made public? Isn't the USGS responsible for warning people about volcanic hazards?" Dr. Foster laughed bitterly. "Detective Mitchell, in 1983, there were over 200,000 people living in areas that would be directly affected by a major eruption of Mount Rainier. The tourism industry around the mountain generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Real estate values in the region depended on people believing they were safe from volcanic hazards." She stood and pulled a thick file from a bookshelf. "This contains the complete record of my correspondence with Alex Chen. including materials I was ordered to destroy by my supervisors at USGS. I've kept it hidden for 16 years, waiting for someone to ask the right questions." Sarah opened the file, finding dozens of letters, geological reports, and what appeared to be classified government documents. The earliest correspondence dated back to March 1983, when Alex had first contacted Dr. Foster about anomalous seismic readings near Mount Rainier. Alex was monitoring earthquake activity as part of his graduate research, Dr. Foster explained. But unlike other researchers who focused on major seismic events, Alex was tracking micro-earthquakes, tiny tremors that are often precursors to increased volcanic activity. His analysis showed a dramatic increase in microseismic activity around Mount Rainier starting in late 1982. Sarah examined Alex's research data, noting the sophisticated statistical analysis and clear presentation of findings. "This looks like professional quality work. Why didn't his faculty advisor support publication?" Because Dr. Steinberg was contacted by federal agents in November 1983 and told that Alex's research involved national security considerations that prohibited public disclosure. Steinberg was offered a generous early retirement package if he would ensure that Alex's findings remained confidential. Dr. Foster pulled out another document, a memorandum on Department of Defense letterhead dated December 1983. "I was ordered to cease all communication with Alex Chen and to turn over any materials related to his research." The memo specifically stated that unauthorized disclosure of volcanic hazard assessments could compromise national security and economic stability in the Pacific Northwest region. Sarah read the memo carefully, noting the official seals and classification markings. "Dr. Foster, this suggests that the government was actively suppressing information about volcanic hazards. That's potentially criminal negligence affecting hundreds of thousands of people." "It gets worse," Dr. Foster replied, opening another section of the file. "In January 1984, just days before Alex and Jake disappeared, I received a phone call from someone claiming to represent the Central Intelligence Agency. This person told me that Alex Chen was planning to go public with classified information and that appropriate measures were being taken to prevent unauthorized disclosure." "Or did you interpret that as a threat against Alex's safety?" Dr. Foster was quiet for a long moment. "At the time, I thought it was just bureaucratic intimidation. Government agencies often use dramatic language to scare researchers away from sensitive topics. But when I learned that Alex had died during his climb, I began to wonder if the timing was coincidental." Sarah leaned forward. "What made you suspicious about Alex's death?" "Several things. First, Alex was an experienced winter climber who wouldn't normally attempt a technical ascent during predicted storm conditions. Second, the weather forecast available to climbers that weekend was significantly more optimistic than the internal meteorological assessments I had access to through USGS. Third, Alex had told me he planned to collect geological samples from high elevations to support his research, but he never specified that he was planning a winter climb. Dr. Foster stood and walked to a window overlooking Puget Sound, where Mount Rainier was visible in the distance. "Detective Mitchell, I've spent 16 years wondering if I could have prevented Alex's death, if I had warned him about the CIA contact, if I had advised him to postpone his research, if I had gone public with our correspondence. Maybe he and Jake would still be alive. Dr. Foster, I need to ask you directly. Do you believe Alex Chen and Jake Morrison were murdered?" She turned back to Sarah, her expression grave. "I believe they were allowed to die. Someone with access to accurate weather forecasts knew that Alex and Jake were planning a climb during dangerous conditions, and that person chose not to warn them. Whether that constitutes murder depends on legal definitions I'm not qualified to assess. Sarah made notes about the timeline of events, the meteorological cover-up, and the chain of federal agency involvement. What happened to your career after Alex's disappearance? I was transferred to a research position studying volcanic activity in Alaska, far from populated areas where my findings might create public concern. I was given a generous salary increase and told that my new assignment was critical to national security. I understood the message. Keep quiet about Cascade volcanism or face the consequences. Dr. Foster returned to her chair, looking older and more tired. For 10 years, I studied remote Alaskan volcanoes that posed no threat to major population centers. My research was competent but meaningless. I retired in 1994, convinced that I had betrayed everything I believed about scientific integrity and public service. Dr. Foster, we've recovered geological samples that Alex Chen collected before his disappearance. Would you be willing to analyze them and compare his findings to current volcanic monitoring data? Her eyes brightened for the first time during the interview. Detective Mitchell, I would consider it an honor to complete Alex's research. He died trying to protect people from volcanic hazards that government officials decided to hide. The least I can do is ensure that his scientific work finally receives the attention it deserved. Sarah handed her photographs of the geological samples recovered from Jake Morrison's backpack. What can you tell me about these specimens? Doctor. Foster examined the photographs with a magnifying glass, her expression growing increasingly excited. These are volcanic glass formations from high-altitude fumaroles, gas vents that emit volcanic gases. The crystal structure and mineral composition can reveal information about magma chamber conditions and volcanic activity levels. She looked up at Sarah with scientific enthusiasm, overcoming her caution. If Alex collected these samples from locations around 11,000, 12,000 feet elevation, they could provide definitive evidence about Mount Rainier's volcanic status in 1984. More importantly, we could compare them to samples collected from the same locations today to determine how volcanic activity has changed over 16 years. Would that analysis prove whether Alex's concerns about increased volcanic activity were justified? Absolutely. Volcanic glass formations are like geological fingerprints. They record precise information about temperature, pressure, and gas composition in volcanic systems. If Alex's samples show higher activity levels than what USGS was reporting publicly in 1984, it would prove that volcanic hazard information was being suppressed. Dr. Foster stood and began pulling reference materials from her bookshelf. Detective Mitchell, I need to show you something that will explain why Alex's research was so threatening to government agencies. She opened a USGS hazard assessment report from 1983, marked internal use only, not for public distribution. The document contained detailed analysis of volcanic risks around Mount Rainier, including evacuation zone maps and population impact assessments. This internal report concluded that a major eruption of Mount Rainier could kill between 20,000 and 50,000 people, depending on the season and time of day. Lahars, volcanic mudflows, could reach populated areas within hours of an eruption, giving residents little time to evacuate. Sarah studied the evacuation zone maps, noting that they included major suburban areas around Tacoma, Puyallup, and Auburn. If USGS knew about these risks, why weren't residents warned? Because the Reagan administration was promoting policies of economic deregulation and reduced government oversight. Officials worried that publicizing volcanic hazards would hurt the regional economy, reduce property values, and create public pressure for expensive evacuation planning and infrastructure modifications. Dr. Foster showed Sarah another document, a White House memorandum from 1983 discussing management of volcanic hazard information for economic stability. The memo specifically ordered USGS to minimize public discussion of volcanic risks that could negatively impact regional economic development. So Alex Chen discovered that the government was deliberately hiding life-threatening information from hundreds of thousands of people. Exactly, and when Alex refused to be silenced, he became a threat to policies that prioritized economic considerations over public safety. His research had the potential to expose one of the most cynical cover-ups in the history of American disaster preparedness. Sarah closed her notebook, overwhelmed by the implications of what Dr. Foster had revealed. What do you think should happen now? How do we honor Alex's memory and ensure that his research finally serves its intended purpose? Dr. Foster was quiet for several minutes, staring out at Mount Rainier. Detective Mitchell, I'm 73 years old. I've spent 16 years living with the guilt of my silence, while Alex Chen's research remained buried. If you can guarantee that this investigation will proceed regardless of political pressure, I'm prepared to testify about everything I know. The correspondence with Alex, the federal agency intimidation, the suppression of volcanic hazard information, and the meteorological cover-up that may have contributed to his death. Dr. Foster, I can't guarantee anything about the political aspects of this investigation, but I can promise that I'll pursue the truth about what happened to Alex Chen and Jake Morrison, regardless of which government agencies might be embarrassed by what we discover. She nodded slowly. Then I'll analyze Alex's geological samples and prepare a complete report on his research findings. If his work proves that Mount Rainier was more active than publicly reported in 1984, it will vindicate his scientific integrity and demonstrate that he died trying to protect his fellow citizens. As Sarah prepared to leave, Dr. Foster handed her a final document, Alex Chen's original research proposal from 1983, outlining his plans to investigate anomalous volcanic activity indicators in the Cascade Range. Alex wrote this proposal before he knew his research would become classified, before he understood the political implications of his findings, and before government agencies began pressuring him to remain silent. This document shows that he was motivated purely by scientific curiosity and concern for public safety. Sarah read Alex's proposal, noting his careful methodology and his stated goal of improving volcanic hazard assessments to protect Pacific Northwest communities. It was the work of an idealistic young scientist who believed that accurate information about natural hazards was essential for public safety. Dr. Foster, Alex Chen and Jake Morrison died as heroes, trying to expose information that could have saved thousands of lives. We're going to make sure the world knows that. As Sarah drove back through Seattle, Mount Rainier dominated the horizon, beautiful, majestic, and potentially deadly. Dr. Margaret Foster's revelations had transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into an examination of government policies that had put hundreds of thousands of people at risk for economic and political reasons. The geological samples recovered from Jake Morrison's backpack might finally provide the scientific proof that Alex Chen had died trying to obtain. If Dr. Foster's analysis confirmed Alex's theories about increased volcanic activity, it would validate the research that had cost two young men their lives and expose a cover-up that had endangered an entire region. But Sarah knew that powerful people would resist having their 16-year-old decisions scrutinized, especially decisions that had prioritized economic considerations over public safety. The next phase of her investigation would require careful documentation, independent scientific verification, and preparation for political pressure that would make some people prefer that the frozen trail remain buried forever. Alex Chen and Jake Morrison deserved justice, and the people living in Mount Rainier's shadow deserved to know the truth about the risks they faced. Dr. Margaret Foster's courage in preserving the evidence for 16 years had finally made that justice possible. The University of Washington's Department of Earth and Space Sciences occupied a modern building on the Seattle campus, its laboratories filled with sophisticated equipment for analyzing geological samples and seismic data. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the department chair, had agreed to conduct an independent analysis of Alex Chen's recovered specimens, working with Detective Sarah Mitchell to ensure that the results would be admissible in court proceedings. Dr. Reynolds was a respected volcanologist who had studied Mount Rainier for 15 years, making her uniquely qualified to evaluate Alex's 1984 samples and compare them to current volcanic monitoring data. At 48, she had built her reputation on meticulous research and unwavering scientific integrity, qualities that made her ideal for an investigation that might challenge official government assessments. Detective Mitchell, I've completed the preliminary analysis of the geological samples you provided, Dr. Reynolds said, as Sarah entered her laboratory. The results are quite remarkable, and they support some very serious concerns about volcanic hazard assessment in the Pacific Northwest. Sarah took a seat near the laboratory workbench, where Alex Chen's preserved specimens were arranged under protective glass covers. 16 years of glacial preservation had kept them in pristine condition, allowing for analysis that would have been impossible if they had been exposed to normal weathering processes. What did your analysis reveal? Dr. Reynolds opened a thick report filled with charts, graphs, and photographic evidence. Alex Chen collected these samples from fumarole fields at elevations between 11,200 and 12,400 feet on Mount Rainier. The volcanic glass formations show clear evidence of increased hydrothermal activity, meaning that magma chamber processes were more active in 1984 than what was being reported publicly. She showed Sarah comparative photographs of volcanic glass samples. These specimens from 1984 show crystalline structures that form only under conditions of elevated temperature and pressure. When I compare them to samples I collected from the same locations in 1998, the difference is dramatic. What does that tell us about Mount Rainier's volcanic status? It tells us that Alex Chen was absolutely correct. Mount Rainier was showing signs of increased activity in 1984 that weren't being acknowledged in official hazard assessments. The temperature and gas emission data encoded in these volcanic glass formations indicate that the volcano was in a more active state than USGS was reporting to the public. Dr. Reynolds pulled up computer models showing volcanic activity levels over time. Based on Alex's samples and my own research, I can now reconstruct Mount Rainier's actual activity levels from 1984 to the present. The data shows that the volcano experienced a significant increase in internal activity between 1983 and 1985, followed by a gradual decline through the 1990s. Sarah studied the models, noting the clear spike in volcanic activity during the period when Alex had been conducting his research. Dr. Reynolds, if Mount Rainier was more active in 1984, what were the implications for public safety? That's where this gets truly disturbing, Dr. Reynolds replied, opening another section of her report. I've compared Alex's findings to the official USGS volcanic hazard assessment that was published in 1984. The government report classified Mount Rainier as low to moderate risk for near-term volcanic activity. She showed Sarah the official 1984 hazard assessment, which had recommended against expensive evacuation planning or infrastructure modifications in the areas surrounding Mount Rainier. But Alex's data shows that Mount Rainier should have been classified as elevated risk, a designation that would have triggered mandatory emergency planning and public warning systems. What would have been the practical difference between those risk classifications? Dr. Reynolds pulled out emergency management guidelines from the 1980s. An elevated risk classification would have required local governments to develop detailed evacuation plans, install warning sirens, conduct public education campaigns about volcanic hazards, and restrict development in the highest risk areas. It also would have mandated increased volcanic monitoring and regular hazard reassessments. None of which happened. Correct. Pierce, King, and Lewis counties, the areas most at risk from Mount Rainier lahars, were never required to develop comprehensive evacuation plans because USGS maintained that the volcanic threat was minimal. People built homes, schools, and businesses in areas that Alex's research showed were at significant risk from volcanic mudflows. Sarah realized the full scope of what Alex Chen had discovered. Dr. Reynolds, are you saying that thousands of people were allowed to live in dangerous areas because the government downplayed volcanic risks? That's exactly what I'm saying, and the geological evidence suggests that Alex knew it. Look at this specimen collection log that was found with his samples. Dr. Reynolds showed Sarah a waterproof notebook that had been preserved alongside the volcanic glass samples. Alex's handwriting documented his growing alarm as he collected specimens that contradicted official safety assessments. Sample R47. Gas emission residue from 1,200 feet elevation shows sulfur dioxide levels 300% higher than USGS baseline measurements. Sample R52. Fumarole temperature readings indicate magma chamber heating beyond reported parameters. Sample R58. Mineral composition suggests recent magma movement inconsistent with low activity classification. Alex's final notebook entry, dated January 21, 1984, the day before he died, contained a chilling assessment. Evidence conclusive that Mount Rainier volcanic activity significantly underreported. Public safety compromised by inaccurate hazard classifications must get samples to independent researchers for verification. Dr. Reynolds looked up from the notebook with obvious admiration. Alex Chen was conducting graduate-level research that was more accurate than the official government assessments. He understood that lives were at stake, and he was willing to risk everything to get the truth out. Sarah asked the question that would determine whether criminal charges might be appropriate. Dr. Reynolds, based on your analysis, was the 1984 USGS hazard assessment scientifically indefensible? Dr. Reynolds considered her words carefully. Detective Mitchell, I can say with scientific certainty that the 1984 official assessment did not reflect the actual volcanic conditions that Alex Chen documented. Whether that represents incompetence, bureaucratic caution, or deliberate misrepresentation is beyond my scientific expertise to determine. But you're confident that Alex's research was scientifically sound? Absolutely. His methodology was sophisticated, his sample collection was systematic, and his analysis was accurate. Alex Chen was conducting professional quality research that met the highest scientific standards. Dr. Reynolds opened a final folder containing her conclusions and recommendations. Detective Mitchell, I believe Alex Chen died trying to prevent a potential disaster that could have killed thousands of people. His research deserved serious consideration by emergency management officials, and his death may have prevented critical safety information from reaching the communities that needed it most. Sarah closed her notebook, having obtained the scientific verification she needed to proceed with the investigation. Dr. Reynolds, would you be willing to testify about your findings if this case goes to trial? I would consider it my professional duty to testify about Alex's research and its implications for public safety. Scientific integrity requires that accurate information about natural hazards be made available to the communities that face those risks. As they concluded the interview, Dr. Reynolds made an observation that crystallized the tragedy of Alex Chen's death. Detective Mitchell, Mount Rainier hasn't had a major eruption since 1894. But volcanic systems operate on geological timescales, decades or centuries between major events. Alex's research suggested that the volcano was entering a more active phase that could last for decades, meaning that the risks Alex identified in 1984 might still exist today. Exactly. If Alex was right about increased volcanic activity, then the people living around Mount Rainier today face the same risks that he tried to warn about 16 years ago. His death didn't eliminate the volcanic hazards, it just delayed public awareness of them. Sarah drove back to Pierce County with Dr. Reynolds' scientific report, knowing that she now had proof that Alex Chen and Jake Morrison had died pursuing legitimate safety concerns that government officials had chosen to suppress. The geological evidence was clear. Mount Rainier had been more active in 1984 than publicly reported, and Alex's research could have saved lives if it had been allowed to reach emergency management officials. But scientific evidence was only part of what Sarah needed to seek justice for the two men who had died on Mount Rainier. She still needed to prove that government agencies had actively suppressed Alex's research, manipulated weather forecasts to endanger the climbers, and engaged in a deliberate cover-up of volcanic hazards that put hundreds of thousands of people at risk. The next phase of her investigation would focus on the federal agents who had pressured Dr. Steinberg and Dr. Foster to remain silent, the CIA officers who had met with volcanic researchers, and the White House officials who had prioritized economic considerations over public safety. Those interviews would be more difficult to arrange and potentially more dangerous to pursue. But Alex Chen and Jake Morrison had risked their lives to expose the truth about Mount Rainier's volcanic hazards. Detective Sarah Mitchell was determined to complete the mission they had died attempting, regardless of which powerful people might prefer that the frozen trail remain buried forever. The geological samples had confirmed that Alex Chen had been a hero, not a conspiracy theorist. Now Sarah needed to prove that his death had been the result of criminal negligence by government officials who had valued economic stability more than human lives. Dr. Reynolds' scientific analysis had provided the foundation for that proof. The volcanic glass formations preserved in glacial ice for 16 years had finally revealed their secrets, and those secrets confirmed that two young men had died trying to protect their fellow Americans from dangers that government agencies had decided to keep hidden. Mount Rainier's geological testimony was clear and unforgiving. Now it was time for human institutions to provide their own accounting for what had happened during that deadly January storm in 1984. The federal building in downtown Seattle housed multiple government agencies, including the local offices of the FBI, U.S. Geological Survey, and various Department of Defense contractors. Detective Sarah Mitchell had spent weeks navigating bureaucratic procedures to arrange interviews with federal officials who had been involved in the suppression of Alex Chen's volcanic research. The cooperation she received varied dramatically depending on which agency she contacted and how much they knew about her investigation. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh had agreed to review Sarah's evidence and consider whether federal charges might be appropriate for the cover-up of volcanic hazard information. At 39, Walsh had built her reputation prosecuting government corruption cases and environmental crimes, making her ideally suited to evaluate the legal implications of Sarah's discoveries. Detective Mitchell, I've reviewed the materials you've provided, the correspondence between Alex Chen and Dr. Foster, the suppressed volcanic hazard assessments, the meteorological manipulation, and Dr. Reynolds' independent scientific analysis, Walsh said as they met in her downtown office. This case presents some of the most serious allegations of government misconduct I've encountered in 15 years as a prosecutor. Sarah had prepared for this meeting by organizing her evidence into categories that would support specific criminal charges. Ms. Walsh, what federal crimes might apply to this situation? Several possibilities, Walsh replied, opening a legal reference manual. Criminal negligence resulting in wrongful death, conspiracy to suppress evidence of public safety threats, obstruction of scientific research related to disaster preparedness, and potentially civil rights violations if we can prove that government agencies knowingly endangered citizens for political reasons. Walsh pulled out copies of federal statutes related to disaster preparedness and emergency management. The Disaster Relief Act of 1974 requires federal agencies to provide accurate hazard assessments to state and local governments for emergency planning purposes. If USGS deliberately provided inaccurate volcanic risk information, it would constitute a federal crime. What about the weather forecast manipulation that may have contributed to Alex and Jake's deaths? That's potentially criminally negligent homicide, Walsh replied grimly. If federal agencies provided inaccurate weather information that contributed to the deaths of Alex Chen and Jake Morrison, it would constitute homicide under federal law. Sarah studied the legal statutes, recognizing that proving criminal intent would require testimony from government officials who had participated in the cover-up. What kind of evidence would we need to pursue federal charges? We'd need testimony from witnesses who can establish that government agencies knowingly provided false information about volcanic hazards and weather conditions. The correspondence you've recovered provides a foundation, but we'd need officials to admit their involvement or provide documentary evidence of the decision-making process. Walsh stood and walked to her window overlooking Elliott Bay, where Mount Rainier was visible in the distance. Detective Mitchell, this case could expose systemic corruption in how the federal government handles disaster preparedness. If we can prove that agencies deliberately suppressed life-threatening information for political reasons, it would represent one of the most serious violations of public trust in modern American history. Over the following weeks, Sarah worked with Walsh to arrange interviews with federal officials who had been involved in the 1984 volcanic hazard assessment. Many had retired or transferred to other positions, but their institutional memory of the Alex Chen case remained vivid. Robert Henley, a former USGS administrator, admitted under oath that he had received guidance from Washington to minimize public discussion of volcanic risks that might impact regional economic development. Susan Morrison, a retired National Weather Service supervisor, confirmed that meteorological briefings to climbers had been modified to appear more optimistic than internal forecasts indicated. Most significantly, James Crawford, a former CIA officer assigned to monitor domestic scientific research with national security implications, acknowledged that his agency had conducted surveillance of volcanic researchers who were deemed potentially disruptive to regional stability. Alex Chen was flagged as a person of interest because his research had the potential to create public panic about volcanic hazards, Crawford testified during a closed federal hearing. Our assessment was that his findings, even if scientifically accurate, could cause economic disruption that would be detrimental to national security interests. The federal investigation culminated in a grand jury hearing where Sarah presented 2 years of accumulated evidence. the preserved geological samples, Dr. Foster's correspondence, Linda Morrison Webb's 16 years of investigation, Dr. Reynolds's scientific analysis, and testimony from government officials who had participated in the cover-up. On March 15, 2002, 18 years after Alex Chen and Jake Morrison had died on Mount Rainier, the federal grand jury issued indictments charging 6 former government officials with criminal negligence, resulting in wrongful death, conspiracy to suppress evidence, and violation of federal disaster preparedness statutes. The trials that followed received national media attention, exposing the systematic suppression of volcanic hazard information that had potentially endangered hundreds of thousands of Pacific Northwest residents. Dr. Margaret Foster, now 75, testified as the prosecution's key witness, describing the government pressure campaign that had silenced legitimate scientific research. Alex Chen died as a hero, Dr. Foster told the court during her emotional testimony. He gave his life trying to protect people from volcanic hazards that government officials had decided to keep secret. His research was scientifically sound, his methodology was professional, and his conclusions could have saved thousands of lives if they had been allowed to reach emergency management officials. And Linda Morrison Webb, now 54, finally saw her brother's reputation vindicated when the court ruled that Jake Morrison and Alex Chen had been courageous Americans who died pursuing legitimate public safety concerns that were being suppressed by government agencies for political and economic reasons. The legal proceedings resulted in significant reforms to federal disaster preparedness policies. Congress passed the Chen-Morrison Volcanic Hazard Disclosure Act, requiring government agencies to provide accurate scientific assessments of natural disaster risks, regardless of economic or political considerations. Mount Rainier was reclassified as a high-risk volcanic system, triggering mandatory evacuation planning and infrastructure improvements in surrounding counties. Dr. Patricia Reynolds was appointed to lead a new independent volcanic hazard assessment board, tasked with ensuring that scientific research about natural disasters could not be suppressed for political reasons. Her first official act was to establish the Alex Chen Memorial Research Fellowship, supporting graduate students investigating volcanic hazards in populated areas. Sarah Mitchell received the Washington State Attorney General's Award for Outstanding Public Service, recognizing her role in exposing a cover-up that had endangered public safety for nearly 2 decades. But the recognition she valued most came from Alex Chen's elderly parents, who traveled from California to thank her for proving that their son had died trying to protect his fellow Americans. Alex always wanted to use his scientific knowledge to help people, his father said through tears at the award ceremony. Detective Mitchell made sure the world knows that Alex was a hero, not a victim of a climbing accident. She gave us back our son's honor. On a clear September morning in 2003, nearly 20 years after their disappearance, Jake Morrison and Alex Chen were honored with a memorial ceremony at Paradise on Mount Rainier. Hundreds of climbers, scientists, and family members gathered to remember 2 young men whose courage had ultimately led to life-saving reforms in disaster preparedness. Sarah stood with Linda Morrison Webb as they watched Mount Rainier's glaciated peak gleaming in the autumn sunshine. The mountain that had claimed Jake and Alex's lives had finally revealed its secrets, and their deaths had not been in vain. They never made it to the summit, Linda said quietly, but they accomplished something more important. They proved that scientific truth can't be buried forever, and that ordinary people can expose even the most powerful cover-ups if they refuse to give up. The frozen trail that had begun with a mysterious backpack emerging from glacial ice had led to justice for 2 heroes whose sacrifice had been hidden for nearly 2 decades. Mount Rainier stood unchanged, its volcanic heart still harboring the potential for future eruptions. But the communities in its shadow were finally equipped with the accurate information they needed to protect themselves. Alex Chen and Jake Morrison had died, believing that truth was more important than political convenience and that scientific integrity was worth any personal cost. Detective Sarah Mitchell had proven them right, ensuring that their frozen legacy would protect future generations from the dangers that powerful people had once tried to hide. The mountain remembers everything, and sometimes, when justice demands it, the mountain reveals what needs to be known. The glacial ice that had preserved Jake Morrison's backpack for 16 years had finally delivered its message. That courage and truth, even when buried under tons of snow and years of silence, will eventually emerge into the light where they belong.